My name's Camilla, and I'm 30 years old. I live in a cozy house, a place full of memories, left to me by my dear grandmother. It's been my sanctuary, my little world where everything just feels right. But, as life would have it, not everything outside these walls is as peaceful. You see, my family is a bit of a mixed bag. There's my husband John, a man of few words, who always seems to be caught in the middle of things. We've had our ups and downs, but who doesn't, right? Then there's my father-in-law, Robert. He was a gem, the kind of man who could light up a room with his smile. I always wondered how he ended up with Helen, my mother-in-law. To put it nicely, Helen is difficult. And that's me being polite. And let's not forget Lucy, John's sister. She lives nearby with her husband and kids in a rented apartment. Lucy and I never really clicked. Maybe it's because she's so much like Helen. I remember this one evening, a typical family dinner at our place. Robert was there, and as usual, he was the life of the party. "Camilla, this lasagna is divine," Robert said with a grin, taking another hearty bite. "Thank you, Robert. It's Grandma's recipe," I replied with a smile. Helen, on the other hand, barely touched her food. She just pushed it around her plate, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. "It's a bit too salty, don't you think?" she said, her voice sharp. John shot me an apologetic glance across the table. I just shrugged it off. "That's Helen for you, always a critic." Lucy chimed in. "Mom, it's fine. Not everyone has your taste buds." The conversation moved on, but the tension lingered, as it always did when Helen was around. After dinner, Robert pulled me aside. "Camilla, I just want to say I really appreciate how you handle Helen. You have the patience of a saint." I laughed. "Well, I try, Robert, but it's not easy." He patted my shoulder. "You're doing great, dear. Just hang in there." If only I knew then how much more hanging in there I'd have to do. That's the thing about life in our little family. You never know what's coming next, especially with Helen and Lucy in the mix. But back then, it was just the usual. A little bit of discomfort, a lot of biting my tongue and trying to keep the peace. Little did I know, the storm was just around the corner. Life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. And one of those came crashing into our lives one cold, dreary morning. Robert, the one person who brought some light into our often tense family gatherings, passed away. It was sudden, a heart attack, they said. He was the glue that held us all together, and without him, things started to unravel quickly. The day after we got the news, I found myself in our kitchen, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, lost in thought. John walked in, looking like he hadn't slept a wink. "He was the best dad anyone could ask for," John said, his voice heavy with sadness. I reached out, placing my hand over his. "I know, honey. He was wonderful. We're going to miss him so much." John nodded, wiping away a tear. "Mom's taking it hard. She's a mess." That wasn't hard to imagine. Helen without Robert was like a ship without a rudder, lost and directionless. And true to form, she became more difficult than ever. Every phone call with her was like walking on eggshells. A week later, we were at Helen's house. Lucy was there too, her eyes red from crying. The air was thick with grief and unspoken tension. "We need to talk about what's next for Mom," Lucy said, breaking the uneasy silence. John sighed. "Yeah, we do. She can't be alone in that big house. She needs someone around, just in case." Helen's gaze shifted to me, her eyes narrowing. "I don't want strangers in my house. What about Camilla? She's home most of the time." I felt my heart sink. This was not what I had signed up for. "Helen, maybe you could stay with Lucy. She's got more space, and the kids would love to have you around." But Helen shook her head, her lips a thin line. "Lucy's place is always so noisy, and I can't stay in this house filled with memories of Robert." The conversation went around in circles, with no one willing to back down. Lucy seemed relieved at the thought of not having her mother move in with her. John looked torn between his mother and me, not sure which side to take. We left Helen's house that day with no resolution in sight. I could feel the storm clouds gathering, a sense of dread settling over me. How were we going to navigate this? How was I going to deal with Helen under my own roof, in the house that was once my sanctuary? As we drove home, John reached for my hand. "We'll figure this out, Camilla. Together, we will defend our independence." I wanted to believe him, I really did. But deep down, I knew things were about to get a whole lot more complicated. The air was tense when we all gathered again at Helen's house. The living room felt smaller than usual, crowded with unspoken thoughts and emotions. Lucy was there, fidgeting nervously, while her husband Mark tried to look anywhere but at Helen. John and I sat on the edge of our seats, bracing for whatever was coming. "So, have we decided what to do about Mom?" Lucy finally broke the silence. Helen, who had been staring out the window, turned sharply. "I've made up my mind," she declared. "I'm giving this house to you, Lucy, and I'm moving in with Camilla and John." My jaw dropped. "What? Helen, we didn't discuss this." Lucy's face lit up, a stark contrast to the shock on mine. "Really, Mom? That would be great." John looked at me and tried to intervene. "Mom, we need to talk about this. It's not that simple." Helen's eyes narrowed. "What's there to talk about? Camilla has plenty of space, and she works from home. It's settled." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Helen, this is a big decision. And what about Lucy? She has more room, and the kids—" Helen cut me off. "Lucy's house is always in chaos with those children. I need peace and quiet." John gave me a helpless look, clearly torn. "Camilla, maybe we can make it work. For a while, at least." So Helen hasn't changed her mind since our last meeting. I felt my frustration mounting. "John, we can't just rearrange our lives because Helen decides so. What about our privacy? Our life?" Lucy chimed in, her voice a little too eager and triumphantly. "Camilla, think about it. Mom needs us now. You wouldn't want her to be alone, would you?" I felt like I was being cornered, my own home slipping away from me. "It's not about that, Lucy. It's about making a decision that affects all of us. We need to think this through." But it was clear that Helen had made up her mind, and Lucy was all too happy to support her decision. John turned out to be too soft, not independent, to make a decision in our favor. As we left Helen's house that day, the weight of the situation settled heavily on my shoulders. I was about to lose the one place where I had always felt safe and at peace, my sanctuary, and there was nothing I could do about it. The days following that dreaded meeting were some of the longest in my life. I tried to argue with John, to make him see reason, but it was like talking to a brick wall. "Camilla, she's my mother. What do you want me to do? Turn her away?" It wasn't that I wanted to turn Helen away. I just wanted a say in what happened in my own home. But it seemed like my say didn't count for much. Before I knew it, the day came when Helen moved in. She arrived with more luggage than I thought possible for one person. My once serene living room was now cluttered with her things. "I hope you don't mind, Camilla. I need all my things around me," Helen said, directing the movers here and there. I forced a smile, hiding my frustration. "Of course, Helen. Make yourself at home." As the days turned into weeks, my patience wore thin. Helen had a way of making her presence felt in every corner of the house. She criticized my cooking, my cleaning, even the way I arranged the living room furniture. One evening, as I was trying to make dinner, Helen came into the kitchen. "You're cutting the carrots all wrong. Here, let me show you how it's done." I bit my tongue, handing her the knife. "Sure, Helen, show me." John walked in just then, and I could see he was trying to gauge the situation. "Everything okay here?" "Just teaching Camilla a thing or two about cooking," Helen said, a hint of smugness in her voice. I kept quiet, focusing on the onions I was chopping. John lingered for a moment, an awkward spectator, before mumbling something about checking the mail and leaving the kitchen. It wasn't just the constant criticism that got to me. It was the way Helen managed to turn John against me. Every time I tried to talk to him about how I felt, he accused me of being insensitive. "Camilla, she's going through a tough time. Can't you just cut her some slack?" John would say. I felt like I was losing not just my home, but my husband too. Then came the day when Helen decided she didn't like the color of the living room walls. "They're too dull. We need something brighter." I found myself reluctantly agreeing to repaint the room, just to keep the peace. As I watched the painters covering my once favorite shade of blue with a garish yellow that Helen had picked, I realized how much of my life I was giving up. My home didn't feel like mine anymore, and I wasn't sure how much more of this I could take. Living with Helen was like being on a never-ending roller coaster, except there were no thrilling moments, just a constant churning in the pit of my stomach. She had a complaint for everything. The food wasn't to her taste, the house wasn't clean enough, and the TV was never on the channel she liked. One evening, as I was trying to finish up some work on my laptop, Helen barged into the room, the TV remote in her hand. "Camilla, this TV is driving me nuts. I can't find my show." I sighed, closing my laptop. "Let me help you, Helen." As I flipped through the channels, trying to find her show, Helen muttered under her breath about how everything was better at her house. John walked in at that moment, and I looked up at him, hoping for some support. "John, can you please help your mother with the TV? I'm trying to finish my work." John frowned, looking from me to Helen. "Can't you see she's struggling, Camilla? It's just a TV show." I felt a surge of frustration. "It's not just about the TV, John. It's about having a little space to do my work, to have a moment of peace in my own house." Helen looked at John, her eyes welling up. "I didn't mean to be a burden. I just wanted to watch my show." John's expression softened as he turned to his mother. "Don't worry, Mom. I'll find your show." I watched as John took the remote from me and started channel surfing, trying to appease Helen. I felt invisible, unheard. The next day, Lucy dropped by with her kids. The house was chaotic, with the kids running around and Helen trying to dictate how to entertain them. I retreated to the kitchen to prepare some snacks, feeling overwhelmed. Lucy followed me into the kitchen, a smirk on her face. "Looks like Mom's really settled in, huh?" I didn't even try to mask my irritation. "It's a lot, Lucy. It's not easy having your entire home life turned upside down." Lucy shrugged, unconcerned. "Well, she's family. You just have to deal with it." That evening, as we all sat down for dinner, the tension was palpable. Helen criticized the pasta I made. John was silent, and Lucy's kids were restless. I finally snapped. "I can't do this anymore. I need some space, some respect in my own home." Helen gasped, and John shot me a look of disbelief. "Camilla, how can you be so selfish?" I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Selfish? I've been nothing but accommodating. This is my home too, John." The argument escalated, voices raised, words flying like daggers. John stormed out of the room, and Helen sat there, looking smug. That night, as I lay in bed, listening to the muffled sounds of the TV from the living room where Helen slept, I realized something had to change. I couldn't live like this anymore. But how was I going to make John see that? How was I going to reclaim my life? The days after the big argument were filled with a tense silence. John and I barely spoke, and Helen acted like she owned the place, more so than ever. I felt like a stranger in my own home, tiptoeing around to avoid any confrontations. But the universe seemed to have other plans for me. One day, I came home early from the grocery store. The house was unusually quiet. As I was putting away the groceries, I heard hushed voices coming from the living room. Curiosity got the better of me, and I tiptoed closer. It was Helen and Lucy, deep in conversation. I couldn't believe my ears when I heard what they were saying. "And now I don't have to deal with yours noisy kids all day," Helen was saying with a chuckle. Moving in with Camilla and John was the best decision. Camilla does everything around the house, and I have all the peace I want. Lucy's voice was equally gleeful. "And I get Dad's house without paying a dime. It worked out perfectly for us." My hands were shaking, and I felt a surge of anger like never before. They had been playing us all along. This wasn't about family or taking care of each other. It was a cold, calculated move. I stormed into the living room, my voice shaking with anger. "I heard everything. How could you, Helen? And you, Lucy?" Helen looked up, startled. Then her expression turned into one of defiance. "What are you talking about, Camilla? We were just chatting." Lucy tried to play innocent. "Yeah, Camilla, you must have misunderstood." But I was done being the understanding, accommodating daughter-in-law. "No, I heard you both. You've been using us, manipulating the situation for your benefit." Helen's face hardened. "You have no right to speak to me like that. I am your elder, and you should respect me." John walked in at that moment, confused. What's going on here? I turned to him, my eyes welling up with tears of frustration. John, they've been using us. Your mother and sister planned all this just so they could get what they wanted. John looked from me to Helen and Lucy, his expression one of disbelief. Is this true, Mom? Helen started to cry, playing the victim. She's lying, John. I would never do such a thing. John seemed torn, unsure of whom to believe. I could see the doubt in his eyes, and it broke my heart. He still didn't trust me, even after everything. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I knew things couldn't go on like this. I had to take a stand for my own sanity. The next day, I was going to have a serious talk with John. It was time to put an end to this charade, one way or another. That morning, I knew it was time for a frank conversation with John. The house was quiet, the tension from the previous night still lingering in the air. I waited in the kitchen, my thoughts racing, until John finally walked in, his face a mask of worry. John, we need to talk about everything that's happening, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He poured himself a coffee and sat down, looking exhausted. Camilla, I just don't know what to think anymore. Think about us, John. Your mother and sister are tearing us apart, I urged. Before we could delve deeper, Helen walked in, her timing too perfect. John, are you going to let her speak about your family like that? The conversation quickly heated up. I tried to explain, to make him see the truth, but Helen's presence was like a fuse, igniting John's temper. You're being unreasonable, Camilla. How can you be so heartless towards my mother? John's voice rose with each word. Frustrated and desperate, I shot back. Heartless? I'm trying to save our home, our marriage. In the heat of the moment, Helen clutched her chest dramatically, gasping. My heart? How can you do this to me? John spun around, his anger flaring. Look what you're doing to her, Camilla. And then, in a flash of fury, John's hand struck my face. The shock of it silenced the room. Helen stood there, a triumphant grin barely hidden. I touched my lip, feeling the sting of the slap and the flowing blood, and the reality of what just happened hit me. My husband had chosen his manipulative mother over me, our marriage. Without a word, I picked up the phone and called the police. As I waited for them, I began to pack Helen's and John's belongings, methodically, my movements fueled by a mix of hurt and determination. John tried to apologize, his anger now replaced with anxiety. Camilla, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to. But it was too late. I'm filing for divorce, John. I can't be in a marriage where I'm not respected, where I'm not safe. The police arrived, and I explained everything. John and Helen were quiet, the reality of their situation finally dawning on them. After the police left, I dragged the suitcases to the front door. Helen's face was a picture of shock as I placed them outside. This is your stuff. You need to leave now, I said, my voice void of any emotion. John picked up the suitcases, his eyes avoiding mine. Helen wanted to scold me again, but then followed him, her triumphant act gone, replaced by a dawning realization of what she had lost. As the door closed behind them, the silence of the house enveloped me. It was a painful moment, but also one of clarity. I had stood up for myself, chosen my dignity over a broken marriage. Now it was time to rebuild my life on my own terms, in my own home. After the divorce was finalized, I found myself in a quiet, almost surreal calm. My house, once a battleground of tension and conflict, was now solely mine again. I spent the first few days just walking through the rooms, taking in the emptiness, the peace that had returned. It felt like waking up from a long, troubled dream. I started by returning the house to its former appearance, undoing the changes Helen had imposed. Each shift, each movement, felt like a step towards reclaiming my life. The walls were repainted back to the soothing blue I loved, the furniture rearranged to the way it used to be. With each change, a sense of normalcy and tranquility returned. My new routine was simple but fulfilling. Mornings were spent in the garden, tending to the flowers that had been neglected, and evenings were for reading books in the quiet of my living room. The house, with all its memories, began to feel like a home again. One afternoon, While pruning the roses, my neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, called out from over the fence. "Camilla, dear, I heard about your divorce. I'm so sorry." I smiled at her, wiping the sweat from my brow. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins. It's been tough, but I'm getting there." She leaned in closer, a conspiratorial glint in her eye. "You know, I hear things haven't been so peaceful at Helen's place either. The whole neighborhood knows about their squabbles. The police have been called there a few times already." I wasn't surprised. Helen, John, Lucy, her husband, and their kids all under one roof was a recipe for constant chaos. I can imagine. Too many conflicting personalities in one space. Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. "You're better off without that drama, dear. You always were too good for them." I laughed, the sound light and free. I'm starting to realize that now. Days turned into weeks, and I began to rediscover parts of myself that I had lost in the turmoil of my marriage. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since college. The strokes of the brush on the canvas were like whispers of a newfound freedom. Occasionally, I'd hear snippets of the ongoing drama at Helen's house. It was a stark reminder of the bullet I had dodged. Their house, once a symbol of familial unity, had become a pressure cooker of arguments and disagreements. In those moments, I felt a twinge of sadness for John, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of relief. I had escaped that life, that endless cycle of unhappiness. I was free to live on my terms, to find happiness in the little things, my garden, my art, my peaceful home. As I sat on my porch one evening, watching the sunset, I realized that this was a new chapter in my life. A chapter where I was the author, free to write my story, one day at a time. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, that uncertainty was exciting, filled with possibilities. I was ready to face whatever came next, on my own terms, in my own way. Look, it's not like Mark and I had fireworks or anything when we met. We just clicked, you know? We were two people who found out we fit well together, and that was that. Love came later, like a surprise guest at a party you didn't know you were throwing. I'm Emily, by the way. Emily Johnson. Well, now it's Patterson since I married Mark. Mark's a great guy, steady and kind. But his family? That's a whole other story. His dad, Mr. Patterson, he's all right. A quiet man who loves his garden more than anything. But his mom, Mrs. Patterson, and I, we just never hit it off. Then there's Linda, married to Mark's older brother Dave. She's the perfect daughter-in-law, always agreeing with Mrs. Patterson, always a step ahead in pleasing her. It's like she's playing a role in some drama where she's the star, and Mrs. Patterson is the adoring audience. So, one day, we're all at their place for dinner. Mark and I, Dave and Linda, and the Pattersons, of course. Mrs. Patterson's going on and on about their new house. You know, the one they got with a huge mortgage? She's like a broken record, always comparing it to our small apartment. Mrs. Patterson's voice cut through the air, sharp and clear. "You really should think about upgrading, Emily. Living in such a cramped space, it's just sad." I tried to keep my cool. "We're happy with what we have, Mrs. Patterson. It's cozy." Linda chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Oh, but just imagine having a place like this. You must be so envious." Mark squeezed my hand under the table, a silent plea for me to let it go. I bit my tongue and forced a smile. "Yeah, Linda, maybe one day," I said, keeping my voice light. Mr. Patterson, trying to change the subject, asked Mark about his work. I was grateful for the distraction. Mark talked about his latest project, and for a moment, we all fell into a more comfortable conversation. But Mrs. Patterson couldn't help herself. "Well, it's good you're keeping busy, Mark. But with Emily not working, I do wonder how you manage. It must be tough." I felt my face flush. "Actually, I've been thinking about starting my own business," I said, more to stand my ground than anything else. Mrs. Patterson raised an eyebrow. "A business? What can you possibly do?" Before I could answer, Linda laughed. "Oh, let's not bore ourselves with fantasies. More wine, anyone?" The evening dragged on, filled with more jabs and thinly veiled insults. By the time Mark and I got back to our apartment, I was fuming. Mark tried to calm me down. "Hey, just ignore them. We know what we have, and that's all that matters." I nodded. But inside, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being looked down upon, of being the underdog in a family that thrived on appearances and material wealth. Little did I know, things were about to get a whole lot more complicated. Life's funny, you know? One minute you're thinking you've got it all figured out, and the next, you're wondering how you got stuck in this sitcom of a family drama. That's how it felt every time we visited Mark's parents. Their new house was like a trophy, big, shiny, and always on display. I remember this one Saturday. Mark and I were at our place, enjoying our usual lazy morning routine, when he got a call from his dad, asking if we could come over. I knew what that meant. Another round of show off the house and make Emily feel small. We got there, and Mrs. Patterson was in full hostess mode, guiding us through rooms we'd seen a dozen times already. And here's the new coffee table we got. Italian marble, you know. It's quite expensive, but you get what you pay for. Mark, bless him, always tried to be diplomatic. Looks great, Mom. Really ties the room together. I just nodded along. What else could I do? Then came the inevitable comparison. I just can't imagine how you two manage in that tiny apartment of yours. It must feel so cramped, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice all sugary concern. I felt my patience wearing thin. It's not that bad, Mrs. Patterson. We like it. She tisked, shaking her head. But you deserve better, Emily. A woman should have a proper home, not some shoebox. Before I could bite back a retort, Mark's dad, Mr. Patterson, called out from the kitchen. Anyone wants a beer? I'll help you, Dad, Mark said quickly, giving me a look that said, please, no drama. I was left alone with Mrs. Patterson and Linda. Linda, ever the eager sidekick, piped up. You know, Emily, there's a certain charm to living minimally, but of course, it's not for everyone. Some of us prefer comfort. Exactly, Linda. Comfort and style, Mrs. Patterson added, glancing around her lavish living room. I forced a smile. Well, everyone has their own taste, right? We're happy with what we have. Mrs. Patterson sniffed. Of course, dear. Happiness is all relative after all. The rest of the visit was more of the same subtle digs and not so subtle boasts. By the time we left, I was mentally exhausted. On the drive back, Mark tried to lighten the mood. Hey, don't let them get to you. You know how they are. I sighed, staring out the window. I know, it feels like it's never going to end, you know? Mark reached over and squeezed my hand. We'll get through it. We always do. But as we drove back to our shoebox, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of frustration. Why did it always have to be a competition with them? Why couldn't they just be happy for us as we were? Life's like a roller coaster, they say. You never see the twist coming. That week was one such twist for me. I got a call from my mom, telling me that Grandpa had passed away. I was heartbroken, of course. He was always kind to me, a bit of a silent supporter in my corner. The shock came when we found out he left me a pretty hefty sum, $500,000. I couldn't believe it. Mark was happy for me, in his quiet way. That's great, Em. Grandpa really cared about you. But when we told his family, well, that was a whole different story. We were at another family dinner when I mentioned it, not thinking much of it. Mrs. Patterson's eyes lit up like Christmas lights. $500,000? My word, Emily, that's quite a sum. Linda was quick to add her 2 cents. Oh, the things you could do with that money. But the mood shifted when Mr. Patterson coughed, a deep, rattling sound that had us all looking his way. He waved us off. Just a bit under the weather, that's all. The conversation moved on, but I couldn't shake off the concern for Mr. Patterson. He looked pale, more tired than usual. It was only a couple of days later when we got the news. Mark's voice was somber when he told me, Dad's sick, Em. Really sick. The doctors are saying it's serious. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. How bad? Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. They're not sure. Could be weeks, maybe less. The news hit the family hard. Mrs. Patterson was a mess, but not in the way you'd expect. It was more about the what now than the what if. We were in their living room, Mrs. Patterson pacing like a caged animal. What are we going to do? The mortgage, the bills. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Mrs. Patterson, Shouldn't we be more worried about Mr. Patterson right now? She rounded on me, her eyes sharp. Of course I'm worried about him, but life goes on, Emily. We have to think about these things. Linda was nodding along, ever the faithful echo. She's right, Emily. It's important to be practical. I looked at Mark, hoping for some support, but he just looked tired, torn between his ailing father and his panicking mother. I bit back any further comments. It wasn't the time or place. But as we left that night, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. It wasn't just Mr. Patterson's illness that worried me. It was the way Mrs. Patterson and Linda were so focused on the money, the house. It felt like priorities were all wrong, and I had a sinking feeling that things were about to get a lot more complicated. Mark's dad's condition worsened fast. It was like watching a candle flicker out. We were spending more time at their place, trying to be there for him, you know? But Mrs. Patterson, she was a whole different story. Always talking about the mortgage, the bills, as if that was the biggest worry. One evening, we were all there, the whole family. Mr. Patterson was lying in bed, looking frail and tired. Out of nowhere, he asked to speak to Mark alone. Just them two. It was strange, seeing him so serious. Mark looked taken aback, but nodded. Sure, Dad, let's talk. They went into the bedroom and closed the door. That's when I noticed Mrs. Patterson and Linda. They were like cats who heard a can opener. Their ears practically perked up. What do you think they're talking about? Linda whispered to Mrs. Patterson, not even trying to hide her curiosity. Mrs. Patterson had that look, you know, like she was trying to solve a puzzle. I don't know, but I bet it's about the will or the house. I was standing there, feeling awkward, when Linda turned to me. Emily, you must be dying to know, right? I mean, with your husband being the only son and all. I shrugged, not wanting to play into their game. It's their business. If Mark wants to tell me, he will. But inside, I was curious. What was so important that it had to be said in private? After what felt like ages, Mark came out. His face was unreadable. Mrs. Patterson and Linda pounced like hawks. Well, what did he say? Mrs. Patterson demanded. Mark shook his head. It's personal, Mom. Dad just had some things to get off his chest. Linda tried a different angle. But it must be about his will, right? Or the house. Mark's expression didn't change. Linda, I'm not discussing it. It was a private conversation. The air was tense after that. Mrs. Patterson kept shooting me these looks, like I was hiding something. But the truth was, I knew as little as she did. That night, back at our place, I asked Mark about it. So, what did your dad want to talk about? Mark was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at me, his eyes serious. He's worried, Em. About Mom, the house, everything. He just wanted to make sure I knew what to do, you know, after... I nodded, understanding. Of course. But deep down, I had this feeling that there was more to it. Something Mark wasn't telling me. And whatever it was, I knew it was big. Mr. Patterson's passing hit everyone like a ton of bricks. It was one of those times when you realize life's too short, but some people never get that memo. The funeral was barely over when Mrs. Patterson started talking about the mortgage again. We were all at their house after the service, kind of a somber gathering when she brought it up. Now that he's gone, we need to think about the future. The mortgage on this house won't pay itself. Linda was nodding along, always her loyal supporter. It's a lot of responsibility, especially now. I was still in my black dress, feeling the weight of the day, when Mark's mom turned to me. Emily, you recently came into some money, right? It only seems fair that you contribute, given the circumstances. I was stunned. Was she really asking me to pay off their mortgage with my inheritance? Mrs. Patterson, it's not why Grandpa left me that money. Mark was rubbing his temples, looking like he wanted to be anywhere but there. Mom, let's not do this now, please. But she was like a dog with a bone. Mark, I'm just being practical. We're family, and families support each other. Emily, you can afford it now, can't you? I felt my face getting hot. It's not about affording it. It's about what's right. That money was meant for me and Mark, for our future. Mrs. Patterson's face hardened. Well, this is your family's future too, isn't it? Unless you don't consider us family. Before I could reply, Mark squeezed my hand. "Let's talk about this later, okay? It's been a long day." But Mrs. Patterson wasn't having it. "No, I want to know now. What will you do, Emily? Will you help your family or not?" The room was tense. Linda was watching me like a hawk, waiting for my response. I took a deep breath. We'll think about it, but this isn't the time or the place to decide." Mrs. Patterson seemed somewhat appeased, but her eyes were cold. "Fine, but remember, family is everything. We have to stick together." As we left, I felt Mark's hand in mine, tight and reassuring. But inside, I was reeling. The nerve of her, asking for my inheritance like it was nothing. It felt like she was trying to claim something that wasn't hers, and it didn't sit right with me at all. After much back and forth and a heavy heart, I decided to use my inheritance to pay off the mortgage on Mrs. Patterson's house. It was a decision I didn't take lightly, and I did it mostly for Mark's sake. We were at Mrs. Patterson's house for a dinner she organized to celebrate the mortgage being paid off. The whole event felt surreal, like being thanked for a favor I never wanted to give. As we sat down for dinner, Mrs. Patterson was beaming. "Emily, this is such a generous contribution you've made. We're all deeply thankful." I nodded, a tight smile on my face. "Happy to help, Mrs. Patterson." Then Linda chimed in with her usual saccharine tone. "Really, Emily, you're just too kind." The dinner was awkward but manageable, until Mrs. Patterson stood up with a glass in her hand for a toast. "I have something to announce. Now that the mortgage is taken care of, I've decided to give this house to Dave and Linda." My jaw dropped. "Excuse me? What did you just say?" I expected Mark to be as shocked as I was, but to my surprise, he just nodded and smiled. "Is that so, Mom? Interesting decision." His calm response threw me off. Why wasn't he upset? Mrs. Patterson looked pleased as punch. "Yes, it only seems right. They need it more, and after all, Emily, you and Mark are doing fine on your own." Linda's grin was wide, almost gloating. "We're just so grateful, aren't we, Dave?" Dave nodded, looking like the cat that got the cream. I was fuming, feeling betrayed and used. "We paid off this house with my money. How can you just give it away to them?" Mrs. Patterson's expression was firm, almost challenging. "I'm still the head of this family, Emily. It's my decision to make." Mark's hand on my knee under the table was a silent message to stay calm. His eyes were telling me he had a plan. As the dinner descended into an uncomfortable silence, my mind was racing. What was Mark up to? He clearly knew something I didn't. The look in his eyes was not of defeat, but of someone holding an ace up their sleeve. As we drove back, I turned to Mark. "You knew, didn't you? You knew what your mother was going to do." Mark's smile was mysterious. "Let's just say, I had a feeling. Don't worry, Em. This isn't over yet." His words were cryptic, but they gave me a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we weren't as outplayed as I thought. Sitting in our living room, the tension was thick. Mark finally broke the silence. "Em, there's something you should know. About the house. Dad did something before he passed." I leaned forward, my heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" Mark took a deep breath. "Dad knew about Mom's plans with the house. He didn't trust her to do right by us. So he changed the mortgage and the house deed into our names." I was stunned. "What? But how?" "He did it right after he found out about his illness," Mark explained. "He wanted to make sure the house went to those who really paid for it. That's us, Em. We own the house now." I couldn't believe it. Mr. Patterson had seen through his wife's intentions and protected us. "But why keep it a secret?" I asked. Mark looked down. "Dad asked me to. He didn't want more drama until it was absolutely necessary." Before we could talk further, there was an aggressive knock. Mrs. Patterson, Dave, and Linda stood at our door, their faces twisted in anger. Mrs. Patterson wasted no time. "Mark, you need to explain this nonsense about the house. This is outrageous." Mark stood up, calm but firm. "Mom, Dad knew what was happening. He legally transferred the house to us, the mortgage too. We paid it off, so now it's ours by law." Their reactions were explosive. Mrs. Patterson's face turned red with fury. "That's impossible. He would never do that to me." Linda was almost hysterical. "This is a lie! You're trying to steal our inheritance!" Dave looked like he was about to explode. "You can't just take the house, Mark. It's not yours." Mark handed them a folder. "Here are the papers. The deed, the mortgage transfer, everything. It's all legal and binding." Mrs. Patterson snatched the papers, her hands trembling. As she scanned them, her face drained of color. This is a trick. You must have forced him," she screamed. "No, Mom. Dad was clear-headed. He did this to protect what's fair," Mark replied, his voice steady. The argument went on, their accusations filling the room. But the truth was in black and white. The house was legally ours. "You've torn this family apart!" Linda yelled, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Patterson turned to me, eyes filled with hatred. "You've done this, Emily! You and your money!" But I stood my ground, feeling a sense of justice. "No, Mrs. Patterson, this was Mr. Patterson's decision. He wanted to right a wrong." Eventually, they left, seething with anger and disbelief. The door closed behind them, leaving us in a bittersweet silence. We had the house, but at what cost? Yet, in my heart, I knew we had honored Mr. Patterson's wishes. He had given us a home, and in doing so, had also given us a new start. We thought the worst was over until Dave, red-faced with anger, burst into our house a few days later. "You think you've won, huh?" Dave was practically shouting. "Dad paid a chunk of the mortgage before he died, $100,000. That means part of the house belongs to us." Mark remained calm, something I'd always admired about him. "Dave, Dad thought of that. He asked me to deposit an equivalent amount into a separate account in case of disputes." I was standing in the corner, watching the scene unfold. Dave, his face a mix of anger and confusion, and Mrs. Patterson, who had followed him in, looking like a thundercloud. "What? That's preposterous," Mrs. Patterson stammered. Mark continued, "The $100,000 will be divided among the heirs, you, Mom, and me. That was Dad's wish." Mrs. Patterson was shaking with rage. "This is a trick! You're manipulating everything! You've always been cruel and selfish." Linda, tears streaming down her face, joined in. "How can you do this to your own family? It's heartless!" The air was thick with tension and accusations. I felt a surge of courage and stepped forward. "Enough!" I raised my voice, something I rarely did. "This is our home. Dad made his decision, and it's legal. It's time you all accept it." Dave was seething. "This isn't the end, Mark. We won't let this go." Mark's response was firm, yet calm. "You do what you need to, Dave. But this was Dad's decision. We're just honoring it." The confrontation ended with Mrs. Patterson, Dave, and Linda leaving our house, their threats and accusations still hanging in the air. As the door closed behind them, Mark and I were left in the quiet of our home, a mixture of relief and sadness in the air. Mark wrapped his arms around me. "I'm sorry you had to go through all this, Em." I leaned into his embrace. "It's not your fault. We did what was right." We stood there for a moment, in the home that had caused so much turmoil, but was now truly ours. The story ends with us, living peacefully in the house, while Mrs. Patterson moved in with Dave and Linda in their small apartment. It wasn't an easy victory, and the family ties were strained, but we had each other and a home that was ours, fair and square. That was enough for us.